Three, two, one. Welcome to this fresh episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEWLP Brattleboro 107.7 FM, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and as always, we will be talking about how things in Montpelier shake out for Windham County. I want to welcome to the show regular contributor Emily Kornheiser. Hello, Emily.
Hello, Olga.
And then we also have with us the lovely Margaret Atkinson, who is the Director of Development and Community Relations at Winston Prouty Center for Child and Family Development, and also co-chair of the Windham Hunger Council, which that's our topic today, is hunger in Vermont, because it is one of those issues that I think COVID has shown a huge spotlight on, and yet has been a very long-term problem in Vermont. And before we get started, I want to give some stats from an organization called Hunger Free Vermont for listeners. We have nearly 60,000 Vermonters who live with food insecurity, meaning they don't always know if they will have the money next week to fill the refrigerator. We have this statistic blows my mind. We have 159,270 residents who have incomes that qualify them for 3 Squares Vermont, which is the food subsidy program. In Vermont, it's federally funded food subsidy program. So that means there are people who are listening to this show right now who probably qualify for this program and may not even realize it. Mm-hmm. And then the monthly shortfall for a family of 4 with 2 adults, monthly shortfall in their food budget for 2 adults with 2 kids, both making minimum wage, the adults, not the children, is just over $2,000, which $2,200 is a lot of money to be short in your budget, especially around something as basic as food. So there are some very big, broad statistics right there. I'm curious, Margaret, since COVID, really got rolling earlier this year, what has the Hunger Council been seeing around hunger in the state?
Well, like almost every place in Vermont, our local Hunger Council, just to say who sits on the council, is representatives from most of the food pantries in the region from Windham County up to Springfield, representatives from churches, municipalities, the food bank, Food Connects, child and family serving organizations like the Springfield Parent-Child Center and Winston County, so there's like a cross sector of social service folks, with occasional input from, other government people, et cetera. So it's and citizens who are interested in the issue of hunger. Our plan for the year, and we generally in regular times, we would meet every other month for an hour and a half with representatives of Hunger Free Vermont, which is the statewide organization that's the backbone for the Hunger Councils, and there's 10 of them in the state. We would usually focus on a topic that was of interest to all the groups, so folks would definitely learn what's going on around things like food access for veterans or child serving programs, whatever. And also we would do projects together to help make the local food system work more efficiently. So all the representatives from the food pantries meet together regularly to figure out ways to combine resources and work with the food bank to make sure that their communities are served in the best way they can. And we've done other projects over the course of the years to collect data and to spread the word. The last couple of years, we've spent a lot of time, making sure that families know about the summer food programs, things like that. So that's, the work that we do is sort of systemic and relationship building among all these organizations, so that when something happens like COVID, we actually have a really great sort of network of people who know and trust each other who can then work together well. So a lot of what we did as the council was just make sure that there was a place to come to coordinate efforts. And so we had coordination around what was going on with the school meals and schools in general as that whole school, thing evolved. How are the food pantries able to work to get food pantries and congregate meal sites? What help did they need? How were they able to meet their, did they need more volunteers? Did they need equipment? How are they going to continue to supply food for their communities? Volunteer coordination and communications. So we tried to just and we met early on, we met weekly to just sort of make sure that everybody knew what was going on because the situation changed so drastically. And to also make sure that we were a place where we could communicate as one voice to our various communities and constituencies about, how to access help and what was going on. So we kind of sort of held that coordination piece, and I think it worked very well because the Hunger Council is active and well attended, and people really have good relationships with each other. As time has gone on, we've met a little less often, but we've had input onto projects that have been generated from the state. Like there's currently a restaurant stimulus program where restaurants
I want to talk about that in a little bit.
To the charitable food system. So that was definitely a place for people to come and have conversations about how that was going to work and who might be available to help with that. And now that things are a little more, I guess, regularized, like we still sort of are holding a place for communication. So I know that one of the things right now that's going to be needed is folks to help volunteer at summer meal sites, which are going to be very different this year. So we have a network that we can sort of, make sure that people know that there's that need and then see that it gets filled. So that's really, we also are a real locus for advocacy to the State House about, some bigger issues over time. And, we haven't forgotten that those issues are there. We provide some of the people power that Hunger Free can motivate when, we need to show up for an issue at the State House or nationally. And
I would add that, oh, sorry. I would just add that one thing Hunger Free Vermont and the Hunger Councils are really good at is taking these very big, complex federal programs and tracking them and getting the information out to people about if there's going to be a funding change, what that could mean. And just to speak to your advocacy part, they're really good at taking these very complex systems and making them tangible for people.
And I think that's been particularly appreciated in this time as we've had many more people have their eyes on the charitable food system. And one thing I've appreciated in an ongoing way about the Hunger Council is how you have a mix of folks who are like deeply dedicated volunteers and folks who are professionals coming into the same room and really collaborating equally on something. So many of those food shelves are run much smaller and are run by volunteers. And then you have something like FoodWorks, which is, a totally professionalized organization in a lot of ways. And as we've sort of gone on this journey through the pandemic, we've seen more people popping up who want to volunteer, who want to create new charitable food projects. We've seen folks who are very active volunteers who are at health risk by their continued volunteering. And so through all of that shifting, which I think really threatened to destabilize a system that was increasingly important and necessary, I've really appreciated that I could trust in you all to be holding so much of the stability there and really helping coordinate that because of those really strong relationships that you have.
I think it's one of the things that has it's been actually a topic of discussion in the Hunger Council about how so much of this really vital safety net for people depends on a bunch of 68-year-old church ladies, and that, they're awesome, but in a situation now where those folks are at the highest risk, it's really a concern. And I think that, on a systemic level, you sort of have to step back and say, is this the best way to deliver this to our community? And I mean, there's things about it that are really important in communities. But it's also, as with much of the social service sector and nonprofit sector, it's also a house of cards, because one little thing can just bring it all down. And it's, this is something that we as Vermonters have built for ourselves in the decisions that we've made. And so we can change it. But it's going to take some really deep thinking about, what kind of structures. And I would say also the success of the Hunger Council has really depended on time. And there was a time when food shelves had a kind of an adversarial relationship with, say, the food bank, and it took a lot of time and working together and airing their opinions and issues and finding ways to make that system better among themselves that has gotten us to the point that we're at today. And so I think the functionality of the system really has depended on all sorts of those sectors building good trusting relationships with each other. And that's really been the value, I think, over time of the council.
One of the pieces that's been really difficult and I think has an opportunity for a lot of change in this time has been all of the folks who are encountering the charitable food system or government bureaucracy for perhaps the first time in their lives, perhaps the first time in a long time. Whether that is folks who are sending their kids down to pick up the free lunch from the school bus or receiving the food stamp cards in the mail, or applying for unemployment benefits and winding their way through the hellscape that is the unemployment bureaucracy, or just being hungry and trying to find food. And so as we have increased eyes on the system and increased need in the system, I think helped illuminate how difficult it can be to navigate for someone who doesn't know it. And so I see so much opportunity there, and I'm curious what opportunities you have seen in that moment as well.
Well, so I think, there's the long term and the short term. And one of the things that, is true about all sort of benefit programs is that we're not as bad as some other states, but there's an application process that is sometimes a disincentive for people. I think we have tried as the Hunger Council and, certainly the agencies that work with people have tried really hard to get folks to do things like apply for 3 squares. Folks don't, the eligibility, folks don't, especially folks who are at the edge of eligibility, they don't know. It's like doing the application answers the question, are you eligible? And right now in this time when there's no work requirements for 3 squares, every person gets the top level of benefit that they qualify for. A lot of the rules, which are, I shall say, federal rules mostly, have been halted during this COVID time. And, the thing that's efficient about 3 squares is that once you qualify, you get the EBT card and you can go to the grocery store and buy food. It doesn't, it doesn't require the infrastructure of giant food giveaways, et cetera, et cetera. It's people just going to the grocery store, and it brings money also into the economy. So for me, getting more people to just use that system that runs quite well in the state is, it's a real opportunity. And so folks who are newly unemployed, or had reductions in hours and have children at home, you should definitely see if you qualify for 3 Squares, because it's a helpful program. And it's also probably the most efficient way to get help.
I think both food stamps and I just call it food stamps, and I know I should call it 3 Squares or EBT, but I find that most people have no idea what Reach Up or 3 Squares or EBT means, and calling it welfare and food stamps is sometimes more transparent. But I realize that it's also stigmatized, so I'll try to switch back and forth. I think both 3 Squares and WIC are incredible opportunities, because what, Olga, you were saying before about how people's budgets are squeezed right now. And even though it seems like food is not negotiable, food is the most negotiable budget item. Rent is fixed, mortgages are fixed, electric bills are mostly fixed. And so it's the only place you can squeeze. And so it's what gets squeezed when something needs to squeeze. And with food stamps and WIC, it means that there's one spot at least that's not getting squeezed, because that can only be spent on food.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Margaret, I want to revisit, Emily had talked about opportunities now that so much attention is on some of our charitable systems. And you brought up a very good point before air, talking about, yes, this is an opportunity, and we have to be careful about how we move forward, and that we don't create what you call a 2-tier system. Could you elaborate on that for listeners? Because I think that is something, the reason it caught my attention is, one, yes, it's something we may not want to have happen, but 2, it reminds me that so often in our charitable food systems and our charitable systems in general, we tell stories about the people who need those systems, but also what leads people to needing those systems are not always the same thing. So someone might be hungry, or 5 people might be hungry, but why they're hungry is not the same thing. And what brought them to being hungry is not the same thing. And so it reminds me of how inflexible our systems can be when perhaps they need to be, because there's so many reasons people come to them. So that's kind of a long intro, but please.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that we really wanted to, the Hunger Council was going to do in the before times, was to start collecting data and tell more stories about, who hungry people are in our community, because it's very easy to sort of float along and not think that maybe the elder who lives next door to you in a lovely house just like yours and your lovely middle-class neighbor might actually be food insecure, because they're living on Social Security and paying their taxes, and they're having tea and toast for dinner every night, and maybe might have a more substantial meal when when their son and daughter come to visit on Sunday. I mean, so that people don't necessarily have the idea of who hungry people are. I think there's a stereotypical idea, and then there's in a place like Windham County, hungry people are really your neighbors, and they're people that except that it's a closely held secret, perhaps. Now with COVID, a lot of people became unemployed and became financially insecure really rapidly through no fault of their own. And the safety net system really mobilized with the portrait of the people they were helping are these folks who've never had to access the system before. But we also have, in Groundworks and Foodworks and Bridget's Kitchen and Loaves and Fishes are feeding, 150 people who are living in hotels, 3 meals a day, day after day. Now, those were folks who were in some sort of distress, many of them for months and even years before now. But they still deserve to get the same quality of food, the same quality of help that somebody who was a working middle-class person 2 months ago and now needs help gets. Both families deserve the same high quality of response. And so, we had started the conversation off air talking about how, folks needing help for the first time may help and having the lived experience of being food insecure will destigmatize food insecurity, which might happen, but it also drives this other thing of a conversation about the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. And when some new projects from the state were being proposed here recently, it surfaced this conversation about, about the danger of developing a two-tiered system that is comfortable and sympathetic and dignified for a certain kind of hungry person and is something else for others. And we don't want that to happen because we want everybody to have the same high quality, sympathetic experience and access to what they need to thrive, no matter where they are in their journey now. And so,
and I think we want those things, both because that is what a civilized society provides for its neighbors, and dignity improves everyone's lives, and because we know that overall, like, our health as a society and each community will be better and less expensive if everyone has those services. And the phenomenon of fault around poverty is so difficult to unpack, because it's really like how far into the complexity of a system can we get our heads around, right? Like, we know there's no fault when someone had a job one day and then the next day the government said you can't have a job. But if we extend out 6 months, or identify the trauma in someone's life that caused them to have a harder time having a job, and how far out into the sort of system of someone's life do we, as grantors of charitable gifts, need to go before we find no fault in someone's life, that they deserve food, which is a horrific exercise to engage in, and I don't think one we should try to do, right?
Well, I think it's almost something that in some ways we don't need to do, but I think the conversations people are now having around policing apply to every aspect of charity and the social safety net. And you have the state making decisions about who deserves something and who doesn't deserve something. And building systems, and I'll say this just, in the thing that I know better, in early childhood, the state has a subsidy for families to pay for childcare, which is another thing that has been revealed in this crisis to be an incredibly important part of, it's an incredibly important thing that helps keep the economy running. The application for childcare subsidy is 8 pages long, and I have an advanced degree, and it's a difficult form that requires people to walk families page by page through it to make sure every box is checked. So we have built a structure that hasn't made it easy for people to access the help that they need. And I just think that, because those are decisions that we have made as people, we can make new decisions to help people to access what they need in a much more humane and streamlined way. And so, when you talk about, hunger is a problem that could be solved if we decide to solve it. I firmly believe that. And, it's going to be hard and it's going to be expensive, but all of these problems could be solved. There's plenty of resources. It's the way they're deployed. And, when you look at what's going on in the State House, there's been enormous gains for these systems in the short terms because of this crisis. I think the proof of our, of our humanity and of our progressivism as a state is what happens long term. How do you continue to maintain these systems as time goes on.
I really appreciate that final point. And I think one of the small pieces of legislative process that is so clear to me is we put our progressivism in one-time money.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the effort to put something into the ongoing budget is a very different conversation, and is really where we almost always fall short. This might be, I don't know if this is a good time for us to take a break and then come back and talk about the legislation that has just passed this week regarding food security.
Just about. We're just at a point to take a break. Thank you, Emily. But before we do, I just want to highlight something this conversation's raising for me, and it reminds me of my time living in the UK. And I had to pay my council tax, which is just a tax you have to pay when you live in London. And in the process of calling the council, which is like a kind of like a select board, I was talking to the person, and he's like, well, you know, your services, what, I don't see you down here for any services. And, you know, oh, I'm not a citizen, so I don't qualify. But the assumption on his part was that as someone living in London, and as someone living in the UK, I immediately qualified for services. And so the assumption was that you're automatically opted in, rather than you have to opt yourself in.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder what it would mean for services in Vermont if we adopted that assumption,
Mm-hmm.
that everyone needs services unless they don't, rather than you don't need services unless you can go through this crazy 8-page application. It's a mind shift more than maybe a structural shift, but it makes me wonder what our services would look like if that was the assumption we were working with.
I love that idea. And I think the way that we've sent EBT cards to every single family in the school district who happen to be in a school district with a high poverty rate is exactly that. It's saying everyone gets this because you're in a community, and it's up to you what you do with it. Mm-hmm. And the shift in people's minds around that is incredible to watch. And one of the things that was scariest for me.
So one of the things that
Go for it, Margaret. I think we do better in person because we like to layer on each other's conversations.
So I mean, the ongoing test of that is something like universal school meals. Mm-hmm. So that is basically that every child who's going to school in Vermont gets breakfast and lunch for free. Right? And so, and you know, there's plenty of ways that families can opt out of that, but that it's, you know, there's certain things that are seen as needed, you know, and children being fed and, you know, able to learn because they're not hungry is like it's as needed as a textbook and a desk and a chalkboard. So that's a place where you could use that model of everybody gets this, because it's better for everybody. It helps all children, and helps those school communities to just run and do their job better. And you know, that to me is like an incremental step in thinking about how the state provides support to its citizens. And that's a real doable thing. Mm-hmm. A couple of years. If we decide that that's, you know, where we want to put resources.
Well, and I wonder too,
practical thing to illustrate that, you know.
Yeah. Thank you, Margaret. Well, I wonder too is, you know, so often when we're talking about services, there's this them and us that can come up. Like, oh, well, I work hard, but I don't get services. And look at this person. What do they do to deserve? Mm-hmm. But it's this scarcity mentality, them and us. And I wonder too, if everyone was just in the system, mm-hmm. if it would ease some of those conversations as well.
I think also as we, more of us are willing to talk about our experiences when we have been using the system, I think that also goes a long way. So as more and more people are opted in, then more and more people can feel comfortable talking about it.
Mhm, mhm.
And so we have a virtuous cycle, as they call in systems theory, where sort of what works builds on what works.
Thank you. So Margaret, Emily, and I will be back in a moment. We're going to take a break to hear from our underwriters, and the Montpelier Happy Hour. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro, 107.7 FM, your community radio station. As always, the opinions and views expressed on this show are those of the host and the guests, and not the radio station. I want to welcome back to the show Margaret Atkinson and Emily Kornheiser. And for those just joining us, we are talking about hunger in Vermont, as well as what has COVID meant for our food systems. And Emily, you want to talk about some legislation that just passed the House, or that has some funding for hunger in our food system.
Yes, so we've passed, I think it'll be just 3 or 4 bills by the time we're done that sort of takes all of the federal money, calling them CRF. We're actually calling them CRF funds, but it's COVID relief funds, so it's a little duplicative. Anyway, so it's taking that billion-something dollars, which on first release seemed like the most magical, exciting thing that was going to transform the face of Vermont into the land of justice and opportunity we have always thought it could be. And then through increasing communications from the feds and from the Federal Reserve, found out that no, that's not what was going to happen, because there are very strict guidelines on how that money can be spent. And that there has to be a very tight nexus to COVID. And so while many of us were thinking more systemically about COVID risk is very, connected to someone's health conditions, and health conditions are really all about sort of the social indicators of health. And so if we could just get our communities more economically viable, and then everything will be beautiful and we'll be healthy and strong forever. That is in fact not how the federal government sees things. And so we need to be a lot more specific. And so what we have wound up with through this is 3 or 4 bills that are essentially these very vibrant laundry lists of ways we want to tackle certain issues in our community, with appropriations going to each of these issues, with this very circular language about how each of these issues connects to COVID. And all of the money has to be spent before December 30th. And I don't know why it's December 30th and not December 31st, but that's what everyone always says. And so I'm repeating that language. And so it means that that's like 6 months. And so not a lot of big work can happen, and some really, really important work can happen that can sort of prove concepts that we've been wanting to prove for a long time. So on the show in previous weeks, we've talked about the fact that everyone that didn't have a home is now housed temporarily. Well, that was true a month ago when we said it then. It's not as true right now.
Yeah.
And how miraculous that was, or seemingly miraculous, but in fact, it just took some money and some effort, and then everyone has some privacy and a place to sleep at night. And so we could keep on doing that with this money. And food is a similar one. And so what was requested from Hunger Free Vermont and a coalition of other advocates was really ways of both transitioning the food system to be resilient to COVID. So those are sort of very practical things around hygiene and a shift in how volunteers are used, given how aging our volunteer base is, and a bunch of other things like that. And then also some ideas for real resiliency in the system going forward. and responding to the increased need. And so what we wound up with is, I think, somewhere halfway in the middle there. And so it's in H965, which is the bill that is focused on healthcare spending and human services spending. We've seen $4.6 million going to the food bank, $12 million going to summer meals programs, and $2 million going to older food security for older Vermonters. And that's usually through Meals on Wheels, Senior Solutions, Senior Meals programs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I'm curious from you, Margaret, where, once that money goes there, what it will be used to do. And what's missing.
Yeah, so the summer meals program is, I think, the thing that's sort of in the most flux and has gone through the biggest, is going through the biggest transition. That's a program that is administered by the Department of Education, and it's a USDA program. And in the past, what it's done is set up congregate meal sites in communities, and also allowed organizations like summer camps and schools to be closed sites and be able to serve USDA subsidized healthy meals to children under 18. And so usually that system works with a sort of an area sponsor. So like in Brattleboro, the school district has, for the last several years, has been the area sponsor for setting up about 13 meal sites around the district, where folks can show up every day, children can show up every day and get a free lunch. And often they're associated with places where there's other kinds of programming. So at Living Memorial Park or at the library. Libraries over the past couple of years have been real centers of summer meals, because it's definitely a place where kids are. And so this year, because you can't safely have congregate meals, it looks to me like the strategy is to continue what the school districts were doing during school time, which is continuing to deliver meals using things like the bus routes and sort of centralized places in communities, and deliver meals in bulk, really, to folks who can pick them up, and then they can be taken home, or and so.
Can I ask a quick clarifying question on that? So my understanding is that during the school year, that was paid for with sort of existing budgeted funds, because school bus routes had already been sort of paid for.
Right.
A contract with the bus system had already been made. The school meals had already been paid for, and those contracts were in place, but none of the contracts were in place for the summer. So it was it's a big leap.
Right, it's like so in some ways there's some structure that's already there. The things that are difficult is that you don't have the personnel. So this $12 million is going to pay for transportation of meals. It's going to pay for things like, the packaging, food, and it's going to pay for food also. But a lot of the infrastructure that is going to be needed to have this kind of program, because you want to make sure that you can still feed as many children as possible. And it also pays, I think, if there's being a summer meal sponsor requires some training, so there's also some expense there as well. And so I know that in our region, out in the Deerfield Valley, there's a school district that isn't doing summer meals, but the meals are going to be picked up by the Stratton Foundation. And so those folks, great for them, but they're going to need some training and some infrastructure to actually pull that off. So that's what that money's paying for, food and the real expenses of having a delivery type system. And I think even with that extra help, that it's not going to be as saturated into the community as the school time program was, because of that loss of the busing. My hope is with good communication over the next couple of weeks. Families are, and that's really, you know, the work of the local communities and local agencies, just really making sure that families know where they can access food, because it's going to be available to them. Locally, I know the school districts are trying to get word out to all families to basically sign up so that they have a good count and a good idea of how much food they need to make and who's going to be at what sites and stuff like that. So it's
towards that conversation of opting in versus opting out. I think one of what I heard from folks about this spring's school delivery was that a lot of families felt like they deserved this in a way that they might not have ever accessed summer meals, because their kids were sort of, you know, not going to school anymore, and their kids were used to getting school lunch at school. And the pressure that I heard from so many folks is not just the financial pressure, but like the emotional and labor pressure of having one meal that doesn't have to be cooked in the midst of all the stress of families being stuck at home together, or kids being home alone while parents are off at essential jobs, or whatever it was. Just like the incredible stress relief of having this meal be provided was really huge for families. And so I'm hopeful that now that folks have experienced that opt-out experience with the school meal delivery, that more families will see this summer food option as something that fits into their lives because they've sort of practiced that receiving already.
Yeah, and you know, the thing is too, is that the reality is many of those children in normal times would have been at camp or at childcare, or like in some other, right, and be getting fed that way. So it's still, you know, it's still something that, you know, all children should, you know, all children do deserve it. It's an entitlement in this world now. Those children are entitled to eat at least those meals for free, and you know, so, you know, if people can at all, you know, find a way to access this, that they should. The stuff for elders, you know, there's the Meals on Wheels and those kind of programs to support elders have, you know, they've been soldiering on in this, you know, changing their practices some, but folks have been getting meals delivered to their homes. A lot of the sort of social contact that comes from sort of those senior center congregate meals, like those things have gone away, and so people are losing that benefit. But Meals on Wheels has been, and Senior Solutions, they have been providing food as much as possible, and as, you know, in a safe manner. And so the extra money in the bill, again, supports some of the extra expense around delivery and packaging, to make sure that our elders are also getting fed. I mean, this is in some ways, a lot of times the talk around hunger sort of turns to children and families, but the highest use of food shelves is among people over 65, I believe, in our region. And, you know, there's a lot of folks who've worked all their life and still need this help. And it's, you know, it's necessarily harder for them because they're far more at risk than young people in the current environment. So it's good that that money came. And the food bank, $4.6 million means that they can acquire more good, healthy food. There's been a lot of transformation over, I mean, a lot of the work of food shelves in the past couple of years since I've been involved in the Hunger Council has been an ongoing discussion about making sure that the food that's provided through the charitable food system is nutritious and healthy, and locally sourced when it can be. There's, you know, Food Connects and, you know, these amazing organizations that have really tried to work with Vermont farmers to make sure that their products are in the charitable food system, because, and there are now, with some of the other sort of short-term programs, a lot of focus on making sure that those farmers and food producers who have lost their restaurant business during this time have another place to sell their product. And there's people, I mean, early on, I'm sure you remember how there was sort of the horror of like hearing about dairy farmers dumping their milk tanks when there was, you know, people who needed food. And so the system may not be perfect, but at least people started to figure out ways where food wasn't going to waste, whether that's supporting agriculture in the way it needs to be supported is another whole question.
Yes.
At least we're not seeing food being plowed under and dumped.
In Vermont, at least.
Vermont, yeah. Yeah, that's like another gigantic system.
No, we don't need to. Yeah.
A couple hours of discussion. But yeah, so, you know, the food bank having, you know, just more money to buy things and again, packaging, delivery, you know, all that stuff is important. And they're, you know, a nonprofit organization that, you know, gets money from various income streams and, you know, they need the support, so.
And then today we are voting on, Olga, did you want to ask any questions about that before I go to the next bill? I'm sorry.
Oh, I just wanted, thank you, Emily. I just wanted to put out there for listeners talking about food and volunteering. The Vermont Food Bank has held for about 10 years a gleaning program where folks go out into the fields and they pick vegetables that are still good, but perhaps the farmer can't sell them to a restaurant or whatever like they normally would. And so you can harvest that food on behalf of the food bank and it goes into the food system. So they're looking for volunteers right now. If you go to the Vermont Food Bank's website, you can find out how to volunteer for that program. And for folks who have been cooped up inside for COVID, it's a great excuse to get back out into your community. So I just wanted to do a shameless plug there for the gleaning program.
Thanks, Olga.
Yeah.
Shameless plug over.
The next bill that hasn't passed yet, but it's on the House floor today, and I'm sure it will pass because things don't actually come to the House floor that aren't going to pass. That's one of the political secrets of the universe that now everyone knows. Is H 966. And that bill has a bunch of pieces in it, but one piece is came out of the Commerce Committee, which I unfortunately no longer sit on because it seems like they've had a lot of fun the last few weeks debating these issues. And there's a section in that around, I think they started the conversation coming from the commerce perspective of how do we support restaurants right now? And what do sort of restaurants bring to our communities that we could find a way for the state to support? And down here in Brattleboro, there's been, and I think actually also in Burlington, based around the Skinny Pancake, which is a whole chain of restaurants, there have been conversations about how restaurants can be sort of transformed to produce meals for folks that wouldn't necessarily come into the restaurant, but might access that food in another way, whether that's in what was once a congregate setting or to be handed out in other ways. And so there's $15 million. Is that right?
I haven't looked at the bill.
Huh. I wrote 15,000 seems like not enough, and 15 million seems like an extraordinary quantity of money compared to this other money. So I'm going to look for a second. What? I'm going to check my notes.
1.5.
Maybe it's 1.5. I'm going to check my notes while perhaps Margaret can tell us about how this was sort of how this shook out. And it seems like it's a collaboration between Sevka and Farm to Table. And I'm really curious about like sort of what are the pros and cons of layering on another system onto our existing system?
Well, I think the idea from the commerce side was to, you know, basically find a way to use the this sort of unused capacity.
Yeah.
Terms while restaurants are closed, you know, finding a way to support restaurants workers getting back to doing some work and being paid to do that. And then, and then providing a thing that's actually really needed in the charitable food system, cooked meals. There are folks who need to eat every day and they don't really have the capacity to cook. So prepackaged meals that they can, heat up or that are ready to eat are really an important part of the system. So that's, fine. And the model up in Burlington is, you can find, it's called shift meals, and it was the Skinny Pancake and I believe some other agencies. And basically it's a way where, folks who need meals can pre-order and sign up for meals, and they come and pick them up for free. And it's a way to add more capacity to the charitable food system. So some folks from Commerce spoke with Stephanie Bonin of the Downtown Brattleboro organization, who of course knows everybody in town and has deep roots in the restaurant community. And there was just a conversation with Hunger Free folks on how would you make something like this happen down here. And I think, the thing about developing sort of a new part or adding capacity to an existing system is that, especially during this crisis time, the existing system is maxed out. The food shelf people are like maxed out. Social service folks are sort of maxed out and also limited in that a lot of the work we've done has to be done remotely. So finding ways to actually build something new together that's going to work for people, and be just and equitable and solve the problem where it's hard. And so from what I know, where it stands now is that SEVCA has become the lead nonprofit agency to sort of hold the work. And thank goodness they had some capacity to pick that up, because one of the things, everybody sort of sat there and said, this seems like a good idea, and then you all look at each other and going, who has the capacity to take this on, because it's a lot. The Downtown Brattleboro organization, Stephanie Bonin's people, they're really the folks who are doing the interface with the restaurants and are sort of staffing the actual implementation. And then the other big capacity that was needed and was found was just large refrigeration capacity and inspected commercial kitchens. And so Mama Says, which is a business in West Brattleboro that makes healthy meals and ships them around the world, was able to also help with sort of their capacity. So they are piecing together, building a program that's going to be making a lot of meals and dispersing them in the community via the delivery and also via the food bank. And so, we'll see how it goes. I don't, one of the things early on was that Commerce really wanted to roll this program out like within weeks. And I think one of the discussions of the community organizations are like, it's going to take more than a couple of weeks to really make sure that we do this right. So, and I think, again, the good relationships between organizations and all, and just people sort of standing up and saying to the state, yeah, this is a good idea and we want to do it, but you cannot pressure us into making this happen on your timeline because it's crazy, I a lot of power to all those organizations to negotiate with the state. And the thing that, as somebody who spent many years in the nonprofit sector, dealing with the state as a funding source and as a partner, to me, that's like one of the key things in solving all these, or working together to solve these problems, is that we have to work together. And, the state has an interest in making sure that people have their needs met and are healthy and can contribute to society. And their partner on the ground and making that happen in community are community agencies. And we're partners. We're not, clients, supplicants.
Servants.
And there has to be times when there has to be a real conversation about whether the state's intent is actually a thing that's right for a community. And so agencies should be able to have those conversations with state funders and be held harmless in that, because what we all have an interest in having things work out. And so, from someone who observed from inside and out, this whole process, I mean, I think the fact that the timeline was extended and the state sort of altered some of its thinking about their original proposal is a good thing, because we all have an interest in having the program work. And, that's, yeah.
No, and as community partners, we need to be able to say, this is not actually enough money to do this well, and so we shouldn't bother, or this is not enough time to do this well. And that's such a terrifying thing to say when that, that might mean that no money comes at all, and, or you won't be able to do what you need to do. The power relationships are very complex, and everyone comes to those conversations with a very different understanding of them. I figured out what my numbers were, that 15,000 was the number of meals that are expected to be provided. And it's $5 million is the dollar figure.
That's
all right. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Margaret.
And so it's an exciting opportunity, I hope, to really do some cross-class conversations. We know that a lot of the folks who work in restaurants are often, especially now, on the financial edge. And so how we can sort of raise that conversation up a little bit, knowing that, one of the reasons I left restaurant work was because there was something difficult for my soul in the fact that I was creating so much beauty and pleasure, and that was only available to some members of my community. And so I think the more we can integrate our food system with that sort of dignity that everyone deserves good food, and that everyone in our community can have a part in providing that, I think there are real opportunities there.
The thing about this program too, I sort of thought, if there was at least one time a week where those meals were available to anybody in the community with a pay-as-you-can kind of thing, you'd find a way to maybe get some sustainability income into something, because folks would, show up and pay for these meals if they can.
Yeah.
Knowing that what they're paying could be turned back into the program. I mean, I think that it's something that could find a way to sustainability with some thought to it. I mean, ultimately, we hope that we get to have enough of an economy again, so that there's restaurants that people can go to.
Yeah,
maybe a while.
One of my struggles with the tourism industry in general, as a person who's sort of invested in an economy that works for everyone, is that a lot of the jobs in the tourism industry are so seasonal in the level of income that comes in, because our restaurants experience considerable seasonality in when people are coming in. And so if this, which is very different from in a lot of cities, where you have where your customer base actually lives in the community. And so if something like this was able to really help restaurants sustain themselves during the shoulder seasons or stick season or whatever you like to call it, I think that would also, and then through whatever the coming dark days of the tourism industry might be, I think that's probably going to last past the fall. And so this seems like a really good opportunity to keep those jobs going.
Yeah, and I hope it's, again, long term, come back to, boy, to see the charitable food system go out of business, and because people have living wages and people have access to health care that won't bankrupt them, and there's so many things that we can also do with our other kinds of policies to raise people up so that the charitable food system shrinks, at least to the point where it's serving many fewer. I mean, the numbers of folks who need help in our community are, it's staggering. And, I keep coming back to, in my town here, in Brattleboro, it's like, what, 63% of the children qualify for free lunch. That's a huge number.
Yeah.
And it's a number that really spiked during the last financial crisis, but it's never really gotten very much better. And that was 10 years ago. And, so I really have to ask the question is like, how do you use the mechanisms of the state to actually make a dent in things like child poverty? And I know that really means people need to think differently about the revenue side of the budget as well as the spending side. And
indeed,
I don't think we're going to have any movement in the nation and in the state until there's a much more rational discussion about where money is, who has it, how it's being used in the world, and what being a great country really means. So.
Oh, Margaret, will you come join me on Ways and Means? We'll have so much fun together. I absolutely agree, and it's. I've tried to find a few glimmers of hope in sort of systemic change. That, as one of the things we've talked about on this show over the last many months, is that COVID helped more people see the deep fractures in our system. And at the beginning, I thought there was a real opportunity as everything sort of broke apart that we might be able to put it back together differently.
Yeah.
And I'm still hoping that there are some places that we can really, that have allowed us to shift the conversation in our state around what the economy is for.
Right, exactly. And, in my work as a fundraiser, I talk to people about, putting their money behind their values. And I think, I've never met anyone who's like pro hungry children. It's like, I mean, they're just not, but folks don't necessarily know what they can personally do to make this system better. And some of it is just like how you're voting and how you, pay attention to some of the big things that seem really hard, but enough people can make a change. And I think too, besides COVID, the recent discussions around Black Lives Matter, I mean, I think suddenly I think people are sort of seeing, oh, you really can make a lot of change if a lot of people stand up in a lot of places and say, we really need to make a change here. And so we can do that around poverty, and we have to. To get equity, to get racial equity, we need to have economic equity too. And it's like all those things are tied up together. And in a state like Vermont, there's so many things that are doable
if we have the will.
I mean, I feel like here we're so small here. We can do better. So.
Yeah.
It's one of the things that's been really inspiring to me about the renewed calls for racial equity and racial justice is that when people stand up and, get out in the streets and really put their voices on the line for these issues, it provides cover and coverage and courage for legislators to do that work. So all of the, both with, economic justice and racial justice, so many bills to really make systemic change on these things have been on the wall for years. It's not that no one's had the idea in the legislature or that no one wants those things in the legislature. It's that they don't become priorities in this like groupthink until enough citizens, stand up and shake their fists about it. And so it's it's such a synergy that to the point that I don't think people necessarily realize that it really does. It makes a huge difference, not because it helps us like think that we need to do something for the first time, but it helps us, it helps the collective focus on a singular issue to the exclusion of the others for just a week or two.
Well, so that's where political will comes from. You know, political, right? It's like they say, oh, this is a great idea, but there's no political will. And you know what shifts political will is people seeing their constituents demanding things. Yeah. And so, and it can be done in a state like Vermont. It's so easy to send an email or send a text or make a phone call to your legislator. And, you know, you and I both know you hear from 5 or 6 people on one thing, and that's like a groundswell of, that's a groundswell of action in Vermont. But, you know, it's easy and it's not. And one of the things I think that COVID has also done, because people were sent home and some of them have the freedom to feel a little bit more detached from the productivity demands of work, that, you know, like they're going to go to the protest because, you know what? Not, you know, I think that like a lot of things have sort of shifted, and people are starting to think about what is really important for, you know, for my family and for my community, and everybody's been jolted out of their regular pattern, or many people, and that's when change happens. And so, yeah, I mean, it's for all that things are hard, it's also kind of hopeful. I hope, you know, and I hope for you, Emily, because you're there, you know, on the Zooms.
I am very hopeful
in the place where
I think one of the things about sort of the 5 emails being a groundswell is, under normal circumstances, I get 5 emails about one issue and 5 emails about another issue and 5 emails about another issue. And for me, that means that I need to stay focused on the big picture, which is that most people can't politically participate until we have economic justice in this state. Because like you said, most people in normal life, in normal land, are going to work and getting their kids and getting dinner on the table and just like spinning and spinning and spinning. And so it takes either economic justice or a full-scale global pandemic to get people to focus on politics for a second. And so I keep my eye on sort of the big picture prizes, because I feel like it will then make space for those smaller shifts that need to happen. But I am hopeful, and I'm hopeful particularly about racial justice legislation in this state right now. And remember the incredibly long arc of history on this. And so, you know, today is Juneteenth, which celebrates, it's just an incredible story to me in the lessons that are available in it, right? So it celebrates the day that slaves in Texas found out that they were free, years after they were technically legally free. And so for me, it's such a powerful reminder of the long arc of history and how long it takes to move justice forward. And I find that heartening rather than discouraging. And also that justice isn't available just because we pass a law. It's only available when that law is fully implemented for everyone across our nation or across our state. And that takes more than just the signing of a pen. It takes a full government administration that's really accountable to the people in a significant way, and to all people in a significant way. And so there are so many lessons for me in what that means we need to do around racial justice or economic justice right now in our communities.
Thank you, Emily. We are way over time, so we need to wrap up, but I do want to remind folks, because today is Juneteenth, for folks who are still quarantining, there are a number of online events happening today around Juneteenth. You can check out your event page on Facebook. They have a number of online events happening. A number of streaming channels like Netflix or Hulu or Amazon have set up pages where they list a number of really great documentaries and films that highlight the work of Black writers and producers and artists and directors. So check those out if you are still staying home. And if you do want to venture out, I just want to remind folks in Windham County that one of the stops on the Vermont African American Heritage Trail is in Grafton. And so if you want to get out and be outside in the fresh air, you can head to Grafton and brush up on the African American experience in Vermont. So, Margaret, Emily, thank you so much for joining us today. And I think we need to toast to the long arc of justice and history and to all the people who are working to move that arc forward. Thank you for joining us today on the Montpelier Happy Hour. The Montpelier Happy Hour is every Friday on WVEW-LP Brattleboro 107.7 at 2 p.m. You can find us on the SoundCloud page, the Vermontitude SoundCloud page. And as always, Emily, where can people find you?
EmilyKornheiser.org, eKornheiser@gmail.com, eKornheiser@ledge.state.vt.us, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and every Saturday morning at 9 a.m. I hold a Zoom town hall conversation with the two other Brattleboro legislators. And tomorrow we are going to be talking about food security. If anyone would like to continue this conversation, 9 a.m. Saturdays via Zoom. You can find the invite on Facebook or Front Porch Forum or by shooting me an email. Thanks.
Emily, Margaret, thank you. Everyone have a great weekend.